This is when Iqbal wrote his famous Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, attempting to shake Muslims out of their moral and political stupor. Three types of individuals had molded the nature of the Muslim community. That is, Taimur the valiant, liberal and generous in the form of Jahangir, and the ideal sort characterized by self-control such as Aurangzeb. The core of Iqbal's message to the Muslims of India was individual self-affirmation or khudi. As far as Iqbal could see, the principle of European democracy as applicable to India needed to recognize the fact of communal groups. In his opinion, the Muslim demand for the creation of a Muslim India within India was perfectly justified. This is where his famous Allahabad address comes in. His famous Allahabad address in 1930, where he proposed the idea of a separate state for Muslims in northwestern India, became a foundational moment in the trajectory towards Pakistan of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. Regarded by many as the most important of Muslim traditionalists, the shifting sands of Azad's religious and political beliefs convey the paradoxes of Muslim identity in South Asia. An individualist like Jinnah, a comparison of the two men's roles in the history of Muslim community of India, exposes the curiosity that passes as communalism in South Asian historiography. Greater clarity, if not a dramatic shift in Muslim ideas on nation and nationality, developed out of a critique of certain variants of Western nationalism spearheaded by Muhammad Iqbal, the Punjabi poet-philosopher. It has been said of Iqbal that he was a man of his age, a man in advance of his age, and a man in profound disagreement with his age. Hailed a messiah who stirred the dead with life, Iqbal was a poet of extraordinary passion, exquisite lyricism, and exceptional complexity. His inspirational power lay in giving philosophic expression to what many upper and middle class Muslims were beginning to feel but could not themselves articulate. A Muslim, an Indian, and a Punjabi of Kashmiri ancestry, all at the same time, Iqbal's individuality was shaped in equal measure by these multiple affiliations. Iqbal began his career as a poet of Wataniyat, penning the Tarana-e-Hindi in 1904, one of the most popular patriotic odes to India. While in Britain, he began reformulating his own views on Wataniyat, which, along with Western materialism, struck him as a recipe for European disaster. Therefore, once he returned to India in 1908, he began writing of the Islamic conception of universal brotherhood. Iqbal was not cutting loose from India so much as appropriating it with the rest of the world. Echoing the thoughts of Jamaluddin Afghani, Iqbal re-invoked the idea of Millat in a language intended to exhilarate his languid and dejected co-religionists. Millat was unencumbered by territory, race, color, and nationalism, and was the ideal community with antecedents going back to the Prophet of Islam. This is when Iqbal wrote his famous Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, attempting to shake Muslims out of their moral and political stupor. Iqbal's Shikwa takes the normative Muslim belief in the absence of intermediaries between the individual and God to the extreme. Here, the Muslim individual questions Allah's sense of justice in rewarding the faithful Muslims so poorly. He was charged by Muslims and Hindus alike for heresy and bigotry. To placate the Muslim ulama, he wrote Jawab-e-Shikwa, which was intended to be God's response to the Muslim individual's charge sheet. To ameliorate the Hindus, he wrote a laudatory poem on Ram. The upshot of the Jawab-e-Shikwa, which ends with an exhortation of loyalty to the Prophet of Islam, is that the subjective feeling of belonging to the community of Prophet Muhammad gave Muslims a sense of nationality, or asbiyat, though not necessarily implying any feeling of hatred against other nationalities. To become a living member of the Muslim community, an individual had to not just profess an unconditional belief in the religious principle, but thoroughly assimilate into the culture of Islam. This alone could create the uniformity of outlook and values within the community. Three types of individuals had molded the nature of the Muslim community. That is, Taimur the valiant, liberal and generous in the form of Jahangir, and the ideal sort characterized by self-control such as Aurangzeb. The core of Iqbal's message to the Muslims of India was individual self-affirmation or khudi. According to Iqbal, the spiritual and the temporal domains were not distinct in Islam, since the nature of the act, however secular in its import, is determined by the attitude of mind with which the agent does it. It was incumbent upon the state to transform these principles into reality by constructing a definite human organization based on Islamic precepts. He held that it was in this alone that the state in Islam was a theocracy. This was not a form of government headed by a representative of God. In other words, the purpose of the state was only to ensure the conditions enabling the realization of the spiritual needs of the individual and the collectivity in temporal activity. incorporating the natural, material, or the secular. As far as Iqbal could see, the principle of European democracy as applicable to India needed to recognize the fact of communal groups. In his opinion, the Muslim demand for the creation of a Muslim India within India was perfectly justified. This is where his famous Allahabad address comes in. Punjab, the northwestern frontier, Sindh and Balochistan were the components of the Indian whole which Iqbal wanted to see develop according to its lights. None of this, he emphasized, should alarm the Hindus or the British. Iqbal dubbed India the greatest Muslim country in the world. A northwest Indian Muslim state was to remain within the subcontinental whole. Far from calling for a partition of India, the creation of an autonomous Muslim state in the northwest was to resolve the problem of India and Asia. Its purpose was to let Muslims living in these provinces develop freely, a prospect which was impossible under the type of unitary government for India contemplated by the nationalist Hindu politician. The explicit Muslimness of Iqbal's proposal drew fire from many non-Muslims, especially the Hindu press. The Muslim press in Punjab deplored the hostile reaction of the Hindu journalistic community, saying that if Munje and Parmanant called for the establishment of a purely Hindu Raj, the Hindu press showered praises on them. And yet, if a Muslim leader simply demanded the protection of the culture and religion of the community, the Hindu press kicked up a storm. Central to Dr. Jalal's analysis of Iqbal is his concept of khudi, or selfhood, which emphasizes individual self-realization and empowerment. Dr. Jalal explores how Iqbal's poetry articulated a vision of Muslims as a dynamic and self-aware community capable of achieving spiritual and intellectual renewal. This concept of khudi was not merely personal, but also carried broader implications for Muslim solidarity and resilience in the face of colonial domination. Dr. Jalal examines Iqbal's evolving political thought, particularly his advocacy for a separate Muslim state in South Asia. While initially supportive of Hindu-Muslim unity, Iqbal's disillusionment with the Congress and his belief in the distinctiveness of Muslim culture and political aspirations led him to endorse the idea of a separate homeland for Muslims. His famous Allahabad address in 1930, where he proposed the idea of a separate state for Muslims in northwestern India, became a foundational moment in the trajectory towards Pakistan. Dr. Jalal underscores Iqbal's role in articulating a philosophical and ideological basis for Pakistan, even though his vision was more abstract and philosophical compared to the practical political strategies of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. She examines how Iqbal's ideas about Islamic universalism, cultural distinctiveness, and political autonomy resonated with Muslims searching for a collective identity and political agency amidst colonial rule and Hindu majority nationalism. Another extraordinary tale of the infinite permutations taken by the individual in relation to Muslim community is provided by the life and times of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. Regarded by many as the most important of Muslim traditionalists, the shifting sands of Azad's religious and political beliefs convey the paradoxes of Muslim identity in South Asia. An individualist like Jinnah, a comparison of the two men's roles in the history of the Muslim community of India, exposes the curiosity that passes as communalism in South Asian historiography. Jinnah, the secular nationalist, slips down a few notches when he begins opposing the mixing of religion and politics by the Gandhian Congress in the early 1920s, and falls from grace altogether when he steals the mantle of the Muslim community in the mid-1930s. By contrast, Azad is showered with accolades in the tomes of Indian nationalist historiography for his steadfast opposition to the Muslim League's drift to separatism and communalism. Islam was the vital component of Azad's identity and the main source of his intellectual and political orientation. In 1904, while still under the influence of Sayyid Ahmad Khan's reformist ideas, Azad once made a fleeting reference to Congress as a Hindu body. Azad's early ideas were laced with a very Muslim exclusivity, which was to later disqualify many of his less Islamically inclined co-religionists from the nationalist mainstream. Article after article in Al-Hilal, his publication, finds Azad preaching the ideal of Islamic brotherhood and exhorting his co-religionists to organize themselves as a separate community under their own imam or amir. He famously wrote, "There will be nothing left of us if we separate religion from politics," and that the Muslims need not follow Hindus to determine their political policy. He was crestfallen to see that Muslims were not united and organized as a community, that they had no qaid or leader and that they were living an un-Islamic and irreligious life. For Azad, the dismantling of the Khilafat along with the Ottoman Empire was a personal and collective calamity for the Muslims. The Khilafat was the emotive extraterritorial issue that stirred the Muslims of India. In December 1919, the Congress, the Muslim League, the All India Khilafat Committee and the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind met simultaneously in Amritsar. It was a rare spectacle of Indian unity, with more people attending than ever before. The recently released Ali Brothers lent an emotional tenor to the proceedings. Shaukat Ali wept while recounting how Muslim sepoys had degraded themselves for a mere 10 or 12 rupees per month to fight against Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. Maulana Muhammad Ali asserted that the government belonged to nobody but God, and that the Muslims were subject of God and not Great Britain. By January 1920, Maulana Azad was out of his 3-year internment and focused on providing a religious justification for combining the Khilafat with Indian nationalism. Needing new and imaginative ways to shore up support for the Khilafat and non-cooperation, Muslims, prompted by Azad's theological arguments, began dabbling with the idea of Hijrat as a substitute for jihad. It was Azad who issued the fatwa, declaring it an Islamic obligation for Muslims to quit India. An analysis of the Hijrat propaganda sheds light on one of the most fascinating and intricate layers in the nexus between identity and sovereignty in Muslim consciousness. The provinces most affected were the Punjab, the Sindh, and later the northwestern frontier, where local Maulvis frightened the Muslims with hellfire if they did not leave India. Ataullah Shah Bukhari told an audience at Hoshiarpur that all Muslims should wear beards lest the Afghans invade India and mistakenly kill them as Christians. He urged Muslims to leave their wives and children under Hindu protection and go off to Afghanistan in silence, as they were destined to return shouting victory. He predicted that if the Khilafat fell, the English would make Mohammedans work as sweepers and use the holy places as stables. Here was a loaded allegory designed to convey to illiterate Muslim audiences the likely effects on their social status if the Khilafat was dismantled. Gandhi reassured Muslims of Hindu support. He did not agree with either Hijrat or Jihad, but would not stand in the way if Muslims wanted to go beyond the non-cooperation program. The Allahabad meeting of the Khilafat Committee endorsed all 4 stages of the non-cooperation movement. In late August 1921, a bloody revolt in which mainly Hindu landlords were hacked to death by the predominantly Muslim Mappila peasants of Malabar dealt a decisive blow to this non-cooperation movement. The reports of forced conversions of Hindus by Muslim peasants, emboldened by Khilafatist propaganda of an Afghan invasion, was a disastrous omen for Indian unity. Efforts by Khilafatists to distance themselves from the revolt cut no ice with large segments of Hindu public opinion. The Hindus were fed up with all the loose talk about an invasion from the northwest and utterly convinced that Gandhi had blundered in giving an irresponsible band of Islamic universalists their head. The question of who spoke for Muslims needed to be addressed if Islamic universalism was to be accommodated within Indian nationalism. One man who had been conscious of this problem was Maulana Azad. Upon joining the Khilafatists, Azad had worked behind the scenes to marshal support of the divines constituting Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind for his bid to take over as Amir of India's Muslims. With the Ali brothers facing a 2-year prison term and none of the prominent ulama capable of pulling the community together, Azad found an opening to make a concerted bid for the leadership of the Muslim community. In September 1921, he had circulated a proposal for the appointment of provincial emirs and an all-India emir. The main principle underlying it was to institute a mechanism for the enforcement of strict obedience by Muslims to the Ahkam-e-Shariat or religious ordinances, and in this way ensure the perpetual preservation of Islamic nationality and democracy. If this were achieved, the Imam-e-Shariat would have authority to pronounce a jihad. Although there was broad agreement on implementing Shariat, there was considerable disagreement about the powers and responsibilities of the Emir and whether or not an oath of allegiance to him was compulsory. Azad, who fancied himself as the prospective Emir-e-Hind, not only favored the oath, but threatened anyone refusing to take it with excommunication. The Ali brothers, Abdul Bari, Hakim Ajmal Khan, to mention only a few, were fiercely opposed to enthroning a dictator, and that too in the form of Azad. When Abdul Bari challenged the Emir-e-Hind's right to exercise such unbridled powers on democratic grounds, he was threatened with murder by Azad's followers. Disappointed but undeterred, Azad continued his 3-year-long effort to become Emir-e-Hind at the Jamiyat-ul-Ulama-e-Hind's annual meeting in November 1921. He flaunted his qualifications for the office with a speech in Arabic, which impressed the audience even though it was completely unintelligible to them. To his dismay, some of the ulama were less keen on appointing an emir than they were in objecting to the prohibition on cow slaughter. Azad and the majority of the Jamiyat had a common interest in wanting to rivet control over India's Muslims. Azad's failure to press his claims as the Emir-e-Shariat was symptomatic of internal fractures within a community, which, although defined by universal religion, had never overcome the particularities of contextual location or the intricacies of personalized faith. At the Lahore session of the Congress in 1929, Azad advised his erstwhile Khilafatist allies to form their own party. The result was the establishment of the Majlis-e-Ihrar, a sectarian Islamist party that was to start campaigns against Ahmadis and Shias in the subcontinent.